Episode 2. Today we're talking about how the Democratic Party still doesn't get why they are unpopular, and some follow-ups to last week. Welcome back, everyone. This is episode 2 of the American Public Discourse. Again, if a very generous creative person wants to send me a better opening musical bit or closing musical bit, I do need it. I'm never going to try to make money off this, no Patreon, no ads, so long as I remember to click the right options on YouTube. But I will take donations of music. I'm not an artist in any way, y'all. Today, for the video on YouTube, I've got some footage from Guild Wars 2. Again, I don't want to film myself talking for forever, so figured I'd just put some video game footage as the video to keep your eyes entertained. I thought it would be really cool to have some Guild Wars 2 footage, mostly doing vistas. If you don't play Guild Wars 2, vistas are this really cool feature where when you explore, there are map icons you can try to get to, and if you reach this little floating map, it plays a view of the area with the camera panning over the area where you're standing, or sometimes it'll go a little past you and just show the view, the area. Usually these are high up and a lot of them are hard to get to, so you sort of have to figure out, okay, if I jump on this box, then I can jump on this pole, and from there I can walk on this ledge. They're quite fun. They're little puzzles quite often. But here's where I went wrong. I wanted to make a new character for this and a new class, so I made a ranger. Seemed cool for wandering and exploring in a more relaxed way. Unfortunately, running around doing 30 minutes of vistas on a level 1 character would be rough, and I didn't have much time to play. So instead, all I've got for you is some early ranger leveling, which is a little frustrating when you get the 4th weapon skill on the greatsword, because it's a block and counter attack that requires the enemy to hit you during the block in order for you to counter. But with a pet, the enemies were never focusing me, so I could never get that skill to go off. I'm sure with like a different pet or something, it would make sense, but it did not feel great in the early levels. No, I'm going to have to cut all that from the audio version. But anyway, back to the podcast. The point of this project is to keep us connected, informed, and aware of what other people are seeing, hearing, and feeling. So if you have a response to anything we talk about, just whatever you want to add, please let me know. If you send in a response, I'm asking for 3 things. 1, your response. If you have personally experienced or seen anything related to what we're talking about, I really want to hear about it. But also just your thoughts on anything, regardless of whether you have personally experienced something. 2, tell me if you want to stay anonymous. And 3, tell me one thing about yourself that has nothing to do with your political opinion. You can send responses to americanpublicdiscourse@gmail.com. That email address should also be in the description of this podcast. Shout out, by the way, to that one listener from Moscow on Spotify, to episode 1. If you're someone in Moscow legitimately interested, thank you and glad to have you here. If you're someone using a VPN, same thing. Thank you for listening and glad to have you here. If you're a Russian government agent who has to listen to every single thing released about American politics, well, you still helped me get one more listen to that very slow launch, so thank you for listening, and I hope you are blessed with a slow work day today. With that, let's get to our topics. All right, can we talk about how the Democratic Party still doesn't seem to understand what they are doing wrong? They lose races that they should be winning, and they are really struggling to keep up and maintain a broad presence across the country. And they keep saying they need to fix their messaging. Yeah, sure, they do need to message better, but do they understand that it's not just messaging? You also need a messenger passionate about the message. Also, a lot of people will have heard me mention Democrats losing across the country broadly and think to themselves, well, that's because they win a lot of voters. But those voters are all in smaller, more densely populated areas. Basically cities. And yes, that's true. But, 1, I'm more interested in talking about what they are doing wrong, so talking about what they're doing right in the cities specifically is just outside of this topic. 2nd, you still have to see that they are losing across the board with just so many groups of people. People I talk to are going further and further to the right in my personal life. But I don't know, if you're experiencing a different trend, let me know. The first thing to acknowledge, though, is there has been a global backlash across parties in power. All across the world, different countries, parties in power have been struggling in elections. Voters are voting out those parties. So the Democrats being in power at the time of the last election, and specifically in power in the presidency, definitely played a huge role. Okay, so there was a trend against parties in power, but it was also a trend against the status quo. And Democrats were reacting so strongly to calling Trump out whenever he lies, which he does do a lot, but calling him out every time and reacting to his attack on government, that they just ended up being the party of no, no, no. No, we can't change this. No, we can't do that. And no, things are not as bad as he says. Everything is fine. That was basically the message that people felt they embodied. When has that ever won an election? No matter how good a job you did as an elected official, systems are never perfect. Programs are never perfect. Policies are almost never perfect. There's always room to improve. So you don't want to be the party of no, nothing needs to change, because everyone can see that's not true. It's never true. You also don't want to be so enamored by what you've built or what you've improved that you can't admit there's room to grow. I don't know, it feels like politicians always have to say what they did was so great and they made no mistakes, even though that'd be impossible. You and I can just look at the world and know that it'd be impossible for an elected official not to make any mistakes and do everything perfectly over 4 years. But somehow Democrats took on this role of defending way too much. Just the general way government operates became theirs to defend. And there's probably a lot of examples where they made exceptions. Really, what I'm saying is actually not entirely true. There's a lot of times where they admitted there's room to change. There's still problems here and there. But that didn't break through. What break through is they are the ones defending everything as it currently exists and not acknowledging any problems. Why? I think it's because of an authenticity issue. The Democrats at the top kind of believe that everything's going great or they're doing a great job. And that's a problem with who is being pushed to the top of the party. That's a big part of what we need to address. Before this next part, we need to separate two things. The party that consists of the elected representatives who run as Democrats who associate with each other versus the party as the entity outside of government that tries to get Democrats elected. So you might see a local party telling you should vote for an incumbent in that general election, because that incumbent is a Democrat in office, even if most actual elected representatives abhor that person. The party entity will usually view it as its job to keep the party in power first and foremost. So that's the party outside of government. Their job, their primary job, is to keep people running as Democrats in elected office. What about the other version of the party? The other version of the party is the group of elected people who associate with each other as Democrats. These are elected Democrats that make up the party as the group in power that associate with each other, and they might be tempted to prioritize keeping other Democrats in power, but at least they understand that that is not supposed to be their main goal as your representative. For more context, we've all heard of the DNC, the Democratic National Committee. That's the party when we refer to the party that's not the people elected as Democrats, but the party whose job it is to get them elected. There's also local versions for that. So if you have Democrats that win in your county, you probably have a county party. That's the Democratic Party of your county. Where I live, the local Democratic Party put out a flyer supporting a whole group of judges currently in power, even some that a lot of people felt should not stay in power, or people who were informed felt should not stay in power. Afterward, people said they blindly just voted to retain all the judges because they thought they should trust the party. They thought that because they agreed with the elected party's values, that meant that if the party, as the entity that gets people elected, supported an incumbent, that candidate was probably good. But I believe the party was supporting the incumbents just because it's their job. They generally support the incumbents that run and win as Democrats. That's it. So keep in mind, as we talk about the Democrats failing, the difference between the party as an organization trying to get their members elected and the party as a group of elected representatives who associate with each other. Now, the Democrats ran a pretty bad 2024 campaign. The first thing is they largely sort of lied about Joe Biden's condition near the end. I'm sure he was better earlier in his presidency. We all saw him campaigning in 2020. Seemed fine. But as things neared the 2024 election, you didn't see Biden coming out as much. And that in itself is not the problem I want to talk about. The problem is that as he was declining in his physical state, they kind of hid that. I mean, I guess I can't really know what happened behind closed doors, who knew what, when he was deteriorating, if it really just came out when he was debating and out on the campaign trail. But it does really feel like they sort of lied to us. And that's just not great in a democracy, right? Like, you can't win an election hiding your candidate behind closed doors. So that's the first problem. And really, I feel like anyone who worked on Joe Biden's re-election campaign or stumped for him and like knew what was going on just shouldn't be allowed to work for other Democrats running for president. Like, don't hire those people who were dishonest with the American people. Unfortunately, I doubt that's going to happen, right? They're probably the top staffers and will stay the top staffers for whoever's next in line. Now let's talk about the other problem with the 2024 campaign. They kind of didn't have a vision for the country. Here's kind of the problem that I get with the Democratic Party. I'm going to try to articulate this. It feels like the Democrats treat advancing in the party kind of just like a normal career track. You've been in there long enough, now it's your turn to run for this, and eventually maybe it'll be your turn to run for president if you really rise in the ranks. That's not a great way to do things because they're not putting forward candidates that meet the moment. When you go into politics, hopefully you're going in because you care about some issue, some moment. You're ready to do something for this country. You are inspired in that moment, and you're ready to push for the things you care about, to fight for your constituents, or just to bring this country together. If you've been doing it for 30 years, great, you've done your time. And if you're looking at it as a career track, you're like, oh yeah, what's the next step? Maybe I should run for a really high office. Maybe I should be secretary of this or that. That's not inspiring, right? That's not who we want running for president. It's not someone who's just advancing in the job and trying to figure out how they keep advancing the job. You want people who are there to meet the moment. And it kind of feels like there's this mentality in the Democratic Party of like, we don't want people whose turn hasn't come yet. They're too new. Let this other person go first. That's just not how you think about an elected office. I don't care how many years of work you've put in as an elected representative fighting for your constituents. You are not entitled to any office, any elected office. It's not an entitlement. It's not a right. None of us, people listening to this show don't get to just say, hey, I've been working for so many years, I get to step into elected office. The person who delivers my mail every day is is a civil servant and doesn't get to just step into the limelight just because they put in decades. So I don't feel like they're putting candidates forward that meet the moment, that have a vision right now. I think they're picking candidates that are tested and have worked and understand how the government works, and that's mostly great, but you still have to have people who are inspired to meet that moment. And if it's just a candidate who's been in it for 30 years and the reasons they came into politics aren't that relevant right now, that's not who you want at the top of your ticket, right? Now, this is less about Biden the first time around. I think he actually did have a moment he was inspired to me in defeating Donald Trump. that's not a message that's going to last long. It clearly didn't last two terms in office, but that was a bit of a moment. But even then, you saw pushback on the younger, more inspired people, and it's not about youth in terms of age group, right? I mean, that does matter to some extent to some people, but youth also means it's not someone who's just been in politics for 30 years and are looking at some polls to figure out what they're supposed to say now. It's someone who's coming in because they care about the issues that exist now. So that's what I mean when I say the Democrats didn't have a vision. Now, Joe Biden stepped down, Kamala Harris stepped in, didn't have a primary. That was all terrible, right? Like, Joe Biden should have stepped aside because, one, he said he would. He promised he would. Two, if he wasn't in the state to be able to run that campaign, he should have stepped down way sooner. But Kamala Harris came in. I don't know that she was the person to advance the types of message she was trying to spread on the campaign trail. Like, she had some policies. So it took a while, sure, but she eventually had policies. She had messages. She had problems she was saying were important. I just don't know that those were the problems she entered politics to solve. I don't know that those were the problems that motivated her to start this journey. And so I don't know that she was the candidate to meet that moment authentically. Here's the other thing. I already brought up that they became the status quo party. Democrats need to be more willing to be creative and try new things. I'm not asking for results in a day, but you have to be willing to try. And there was a bit of a sense in the campaign that Democrats came in initially saying, oh, you all just don't understand. It takes 15 years for results in the federal government. It takes a very long time for things to be implemented, for things to work. That's not a great answer. If you're going to your boss and they're like, hey, how can we get this done in 2 months? You want at least some proposals, even if you're like, I don't know if this could work, but maybe we could try this. You don't just want to say, you just can't. Give me 15 years. I get that it might not work, but you have to be willing to try. Don't tell us that things just can't be fixed quickly and that's the end of the conversation. Give your best idea for fixing them quickly. Because if you're out of ideas, voters will find someone who isn't. Now, again, they did eventually get a little bit more creative and sort of backing away from the, voters just don't understand that it takes a while to do things in the federal government. And actually, Biden did try to do some things quickly and he ran into issues in the court. But that just didn't break through. And again, I think there's an authenticity issue where, yeah, they espoused a lot of the things I'm saying, but it didn't resonate because the people delivering the message weren't the ones who actually believed it. The Democrats keep feeling like they have to moderate, and I don't want to take position on like where they should line on a left to right political spectrum. I actually don't even think a left to right political spectrum is a good way of looking at the world a lot of the time. But I think they're missing the point because they're trying to like poll test and sanitize their message to the perfect political place to win the medium voter, all that stuff. I think that they're missing the point that they need someone who actually believes in what they're saying. And then even if they're a little bit off of the like perfect poll tested location, that'll be more inspiring and break through on the messaging a lot more than someone who's just repeating what someone else told them is the ideal position to take. Now we're probably thinking, well, isn't that what primaries are for? Isn't it Democratic primary voters that actually chose who gets on top of the ticket and all that? And yeah, that's true to a large extent. And I think part of the culture in the National Party is bleeding into the voters a little bit, with some people feeling they have to vote for the most plain candidate who's got the best chance of winning. But I don't know that that's that big of a function. And I'm sure there's people with actual data who would know more. I'm just sort of talking about what I've experienced looking at it and seen around me, looking at people watching these candidates messaging and watching what seems to work. But there is another component too, which is, again, the Democratic Party is the institution that gets Democrats elected, does seem to also push things pretty strongly in one direction or another, endorse one candidate quite often, and they will also just put out that messaging about where they think the party needs to be and all that, and that'll push other people to fall in line. So you have other elected officials that are kind of falling in line behind the quote-unquote party leader. So I think if you're not the person who's supposed to win the next election, the person who's done the time, who seems to be the person who's, come up through the party, you're facing some strong headwinds before we even factor in the voters. Anyway, to conclude, basically, I think Democrats keep talking about messaging, and that's great, and there was a time where that was something that they really need to fix. But they are not realizing that the messenger matters. And if you came into politics for completely different sets of issues 30 years ago, maybe you're inspired and you can meet this moment. But just because you've done 30, 40 years of politics, that doesn't mean you are the person to meet the moment. In fact, you might be the wrong person for it. All right, a bit of a separate topic here, but related. What can Democrats do now? Obviously, they're not the party in power right now, so let's talk about right now. Early on, they offered to work with DOGE. That's the Department of Government Efficiency that's making a lot of changes and or advising on a lot of changes, depending who you ask in the federal government. DOGE wasn't interested in working with the Democrats. Some of the Democrats stood with protesters. I hope that helped inspire the people who needed it, who were there, but it didn't do much else. They tried to push their colleagues to question DOGE. Has that worked? Or is it the pushback from constituents? It's hard to say, but at least things are moving in the direction that Democrats wanted in terms of the Republicans starting to question DOGE and Musk a little bit, at least gently asking what it is doing, what are the cuts it's making. So if that's what the Democrats wanted, they should keep their foot on the gas there, I guess. What about the recent threat of a government shutdown? The government was on the precipice of a shutdown this week, what Democrats in the Senate needed to pass a short-term budget resolution. It wasn't going to pass without Democratic votes. It sounds like the bill isn't exactly what Democrats would want, but it doesn't have dramatic changes either. Some earlier versions did, but it sounds, and I didn't look into this as thoroughly as I would have liked, but it sounds like it wasn't a dramatic change from the Biden-era bills. By the way, for all the talk of finding cuts to make to the federal spending, that's not in this bill. Again, the Republican legislators were asking DOGE and Elon Musk to actually tell them what he has found so they can implement it, but that has not happened yet. Again, Congress passes the budget. So unless Congress makes a change, that money is still being allocated to be spent. If the executive branch wants to spend less, they have to come back to Congress and say, hey, put less money into this and less money into that. That step has not really happened yet. There's been some announcements from the executive branch trying to say what they've cut, but then whenever it goes back to Congress, it turns out that maybe the executive branch misunderstood the numbers, or it was a contract that was already fully paid for anyway. Not everything, but the point is they haven't really implemented that at the congressional level yet. So at first it sounded like Democrats were all going to vote against the budget resolution. Then what happened was Chuck Schumer, leader of the Senate Democrats, turned it around and got him and a few other Democrats to vote for it to keep the government open. And that really angered all the other Democrats in Congress. They felt like they had no power, and this budget was the one tool they had to force Republicans to negotiate with them, right? Because they need, 7 or 8 Democratic votes in the Senate. The Democrats want to say, give us something for those votes. Instead, Chuck Schumer and a few other Democrats caved and just gave up those votes. So who was right here? The Democrats who are very, very mad at Chuck Schumer, or the few Democrats who voted to get this through? And I mean that in terms of regardless of what side you're on politically, what was the right choice for Democrats strategically? Well, Democrats who wanted to play hardball were looking at this like the shutdown would hurt the Trump administration. And you know what? Even though the administration is sort of thriving in chaos here, the administration was not asking for a shutdown. Republicans were not pushing for a shutdown. At least it didn't come off that way. So in that light, Democrats may have been right that Trump would not have benefited from the shutdown and maybe would have felt pressure to come to the negotiating table. Keep in mind, too, we are not talking about an opposition party that is just not happy with the current administration's policies in a normal sense. This is an opposition party that believes we are in a crisis where the country is being dismantled and sold out from beneath us. And this is the first time they had any real power to do anything about it. But Democrats did try to work with Republicans a bit early on. They tried to ask for adjustments here or there, especially in the House, and it doesn't sound like they got anything. So on the other side, what was Chuck Schumer looking at? He said this vague thing about how if there was a shutdown, there'd be no check on Trump. I keep hearing people playing this segment of a speech he made where it's like this very vague, like, oh yeah, we need the government to keep operating or else there's no check on Trump's power and he'll do this and that without the government being able to do anything. You might be thinking, well, what check is there now with the government open? Let's be precise. It's the courts. I don't know why people keep talking about this so vaguely. The courts are the main check on Trump right now, and they would have been impacted. As far as I can tell, they could have gone on for a couple weeks, but they would have been impacted. And then what? After whatever funding they had ran tight, they could have just heard criminal cases, because I guess those are necessary, while the government is shut down. There's a chance they would not have been hearing civil cases anymore, so they could not have heard the lawsuits against the government that might have slowed down or stopped some things the Trump administration is doing that the courts think is illegal. So those cases against Trump would have been halted greatly. But if the Democrats had played hardball, what concessions could they have gotten? Maybe a hearing on Doge? A fat chance of Elon Musk being told to come testify? I don't think Republicans have the spine to ask for that. Maybe a requirement that Trump deliver a plan for those frozen USAID funds and a vote on whether he's allowed to impound them. I mean, that's already the law, so I don't know what difference it would have made unless they executed it flawlessly, but I don't quite know what concessions they were trying to get there. I think really they were just going for slowing down Trump because he is using the resources of the executive branch, so cutting off those resources may have hurt him. But again, either way, passing the budget keeps the courts running. I guess I'm somehow saying Schumer made maybe the right strategic choice. Surprising because of everything I just said about the Democratic Party leadership. But if Democrats had caused the courts to weaken, that would have been horrible for both the country as a whole and also for the things Democrats specifically care about in this moment. But I'm not really confident in my assessment here of where I come out on what the better choice was strategically. They really didn't have good options here. I don't know. Let me know what you think. Help me come to a conclusion here on what was the better strategic choice for Democrats and what they should have done. And beyond strategy, obviously, if you care substantively about the issues at play, feel free to comment on that as well. Again, responses can be sent to americanpublicdiscourse@gmail.com. The other topic today is a brief follow-up on last week. Last week, I brought up the topic of the fired federal employees. First, I talked about what is going on. Those facts are already very outdated. Without going over everything, I will just give the biggest example. Half of the Department of Education was laid off this past week. Meanwhile, courts ordered a bunch more rehiring, so let's just say it's developing quickly. I also talked about some reasons this might be happening. Last episode, the first possible reason I came up with for these mass firings happening so fast, and frankly so messily, is they could be trying to irreparably burn down some parts of the executive branch faster than it can be fixed. I did not mention one of the reasons I think this is actually a very likely reason is that it's already happening. What I mean by that is the federal government is already destroying things, and then when it turns out that they have to fix it, saying it's too late. We all remember USAID. The executive branch froze a bunch of funds that were already passed by Congress. Congress already told the executive branch, this is what you have to pay this for, this is what you have to pay this for, this is how much you should pay here, right? Congress controls the budget, not the executive branch. So federal government froze a bunch of funds that USAID was supposed to pay. Of course, people sued. Y'all saw that coming. So this went to court. Eventually, the court said, yeah, you have to release those funds. It was a temporary restraining order saying you can't freeze them, so essentially saying you have to release them. So the federal government, the executive branch, lost there. What happened was they then didn't immediately pay those funds. They came back to court, and court was kind of like, what the heck? I already told you got to pay those funds. Pay them out already. Federal government still couldn't do it. Eventually, the federal government started arguing, hey, we can't pay them that fast. It's going to take a while to process. It takes a while to undo this freeze we did. So they're already saying, hey, this freeze that we implemented pretty darn quickly, now that you're telling us, oh, we actually couldn't have done that, it's kind of too late for us to really quickly undo it, We're working on it, but give us some time, this and that. So they're already using the speed at which they are affecting the executive branch to prevent the other branches from doing anything about it. So I should have brought up that example. By the way, that court case then went all the way up to the Supreme Court on some emergency stuff. Supreme Court paused the lower court's order for a few days while they decided the case. Eventually, they released an order saying, yeah, you do have to listen to the lower court on this one, and sent it back down. It's still with the lower court at this point. Now, when fighting against having to pay out so quickly and come back to court and having to answer for why they didn't obey the court order, the executive branch got a little creative. This was the bullshitty kind of creative, not the smart kind, with how they interpreted the original order. Essentially, where the court order would say, hey, you can't implement this freeze, they would say, oh yeah, well, we came up with another freeze. It was silly. If you ever watched the YouTube channel Legal Eagle, they had a great video on this. It's a channel for anyone, no matter how informed you are on the law and current events. It does a great job of breaking things down, and even if you already know your stuff, delving deeper than most sources. Is it completely neutral? I guess maybe not. I mean, the guy's not happy with the government's stunt here, but I'm not either. So, in conclusion, it really sounds like the plan is to move so fast with whatever they want that if anyone says they didn't have the power to do it, it's too late. I also did get some feedback to last week. Again, if you want to respond, send me an email. Feedback I got last week. To what extent does your base case idea here, namely crediting at face value the motives of people in government who are firing everyone, itself problematic? Like, you noted that Trump immediately fired a bunch of folks at the Office of Inspector General. They've also directed various regulators, the DOJ and SEC among others, to dismiss investigations into themselves and their allies. Isn't accepting their explanation that these are efforts to end government waste a form of unwarranted normalization for corrupt conduct? In any other context, nobody would accept this kind of thing. Like in the business world, if your CEO is accused of misconduct, the General Counsel Office hired outside counsel to investigate, and the CEO fired the outside counsel, the whole company would implode with civil litigation. Yeah, that's true. I don't think there's any other context where someone would get away with this. You might be right that I'm giving too much credit and through that normalizing things. Like I said last week, no one has the right to work for the federal government, but firing all the watchdogs first, the inspectors general, is a huge issue we need to keep our eye on. Again, Trump did not fire them and then try to replace them. He also fired people he had put in place in his first term. So these are not partisan political actors that were put in place by the Democrats. He just fired them and then left those offices empty. It's not a good sign. So am I normalizing all this by including the arguments the government made for firing all these people? I wish I weren't, but probably yes. The flip side is, if someone is worried about what Trump is doing and trying to figure out what to respond to, I do think there's merit in saying, hey, firing 5,000 people here or there is not what you need to focus on right now. It's got an emotional impact, but keep your eye on the ball. The government has been purged of the very people who watch all corners for fraud and abuse, and that is more important than just the fact that they're firing a lot of people. Another example of people missing what's important is I think they're freaking out a little too much about the independence of agencies. And that's something that like a year ago I would have said is a very big deal. It's a really important conversation. But right now, depending on exactly the agency at issue and what Trump is trying to do, we have bigger problems. it'll go to the courts, and if people make the independence of agencies into this huge moral crisis, what will they do if the courts rule the other way? We discussed last episode that the appellate court stopped the stay on Dellinger's firing, the head of the Office of Special Counsel, meaning he could be fired. Now, that didn't go to a real appellate court ruling, but what does that hint about how they might rule when a case goes to a real decision? But am I giving too much credit to Trump's arguments for the firings? After the USAID situation, maybe I am. There's definitely a case to be made that a lot of reform needs to happen in the government, but maybe this administration has lost too much credibility on that. But another complication there is that people did vote for reducing the federal government. So we kind of have to credit the reasons people voted for it, even if the administration seems to have gone now in a different direction as the primary goal. If we disregard the real reasons people want the federal workforce reduced, then those people will tune out all the concerns about what Trump is actually doing because they know they had a well-intentioned reason for voting to reduce the federal workforce. So I guess my struggle there was, even if I feel like Trump has not gone about this the right way, the people who voted for him still had real reasons for why they did that, and it's hard to separate the two. How do I give credit to the people who had reasons for wanting to reduce the federal government while saying, hey, I don't think Trump is actually implementing your goals very well? If you disagree, write in. Feel free to push back in any direction. Again, I won't pick and choose feedback to fit a narrative, and I'm not here to criticize anyone. I want to elevate your voices even if you disagree with me on everything. One more thing about this topic. I've talked a lot about fraud and corruption. Maybe no one these days does a good job saying what they're worried about when we talk about fraud and corruption. Maybe that's why we tend to only see it when the other side is in office. I'm a little worried about people lining their own pockets, of course. The budget for this year originally had as its biggest line item $400 million spent to buy quote-unquote armored Teslas. And then that was quietly removed when it was questioned. So people taking money and resources is one concern, as well as skirting rules that are supposed to protect the rest of us. Or selling out the country by giving all our social security numbers to the highest bidder or something. The bigger concern I have is someone in power having too much ability to block anyone from removing them from power. If our separation of powers, our checks and balances between the three branches of power get too weakened, the executive branch could make it very difficult to get voted out of office. Here's the fundamental question I have for the state of our country and what I ask myself day by day. Am I still confident that we have the ability to vote out the people in power at the next scheduled election? And if the president tries anything really, really stupid, to stay in power or to keep his faction in power, then it's up to the courts and the legislative branch to stop it, right? Impeachment or the courts saying, no, you're just wrong, you are no longer the president. But we need separation of powers in order for that to work. So that's one of the major reasons separation of powers was one of the two major issues I suggested we need to keep our eye on amongst the chaos. And if you get too corrupt, if you get too fraudulent in the federal government, you get more and more ability to, in ways you should not be allowed to do, push the other branches to do your bidding. Or just hide whatever happens from them, right? Votes are supposed to be certified by Congress. The more the executive branch wields way more power than it should have over things it shouldn't have power over, the more it can stop Congress from being a check on it. If you have anything you wanted to add to the topic we started last week, to the topic about firing federal employees, send it in. Especially if you have interacted with any of these impacted agencies and maybe you've seen ramifications, or maybe you interacted with them and everything seems fine to you. Maybe you've been to the VA recently and everything seemed good. Either way, let me know. But also, even if you just have thoughts to add and it's not a personal experience, let me know and I will either bring it up when we conclude this topic next week, or just whenever you send it in. I can bring it back up even if it's way in the future. We go with the flow here. Thank you for listening. Again, the email to pitch into the conversation is americanpublicdiscourse@gmail.com. If you enjoyed the show, leave a rating and a comment. If you didn't enjoy it, send me an email and let me know what I can do better. Some topics I'm thinking about for future episodes are Ukraine, artificial intelligence, and ranked choice voting. Maybe tariffs, too. I also think there's a lot of important stuff to talk about with the recent detention of that Columbia student. Let me know if you're interested in any of those or something else. Once this gets off the ground, I really want to use it to empower the audience's voices, not just have people listen to me babble on. Thank you for listening, everyone, and happy St. Patrick's Day. Alright, it's going to be harder than ever not to be weakened, isolated, and ignorant. The algorithms push us toward our little isolated bubbles, so stay connected and stay informed. Don't let the world isolate us.